And go live. So I can begin.
There you are. Just go ahead and tell them to start, or you start it.
You can start.
Good. Well, welcome to what we're calling an RTB Live. My name is Ken Samples, and I'm one of the RTB staff scholars. Kind of an oddball at the RTB office because I'm not a scientist. My background is in philosophy and theology. And I'm joined by a real person I've known for a long time, George Haraxon. George, I'm so happy to be able to do a program with you.
Oh, I'm very excited to do it with you, Ken.
You know, I think, George, that was thinking back that I probably have known you about 25 years. I thought we met maybe in the mid 90s. And I know you have been a longtime pastor. I also know that you are a philosophy professor. Tell everybody what your new position is at RTB and how long have you been with RTB now?
Yeah, I just celebrated 1 year here on staff at RTB, being the scholar and apologetics community manager. So I get to meet everyone that's coming into both of those communities, interact with them, manage those communities, help strengthen and build it up.
Well, excellent. George, we have, of course, people from the scholar community, visiting scholars may be listening, and they'll see this as an opportunity to pick up from us ideas that we think are critically important. So we're calling it a webinar. George, today we want to talk about something that I know is very important to me and to you. It is what we call the golden rule of apologetics. And I first learned that idea. The first time I ever heard of the golden rule of apologetics was an old friend of mine named Bob Passantino. And I had never heard of that. And, you know, Bob talked about the idea of treating other people's beliefs the way you want yours treated. So I thought we could kind of go into that topic. And I wonder if we could kind of begin by talking a little bit about the golden rule. If we're applying the golden rule to apologetics, what is the golden rule and how important is it?
Yeah, as you've written about it, coming from Matthew and the other Gospels, Jesus said, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. And I like what you've said before, that this includes people's beliefs, their writings, their arguments. Treat them the way you would want your beliefs, arguments, and writing to be treated.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, of course, you know, the golden rule, treat other people the way you want to be treated, kind of part of those two great commandments, love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, your neighbor as yourself. Now, I'm hoping that I don't have to do this perfectly. I'm hoping that I'm striving to do this because I'm not always, it's not always easy for a forgiven sinner like me to break outside of myself and love other people. But just as we strive to love people and to respect people and honor God, we're also striving to do this in apologetics.
Yeah, I like what Dallas Willard once said, that grace is opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort. And we should put effort in developing this skill and developing these virtues. The golden rule has served me well as a philosopher or teaching philosophy, as a pastor for over 20 years, doing counseling. Even when I was a server, a bartender, I was a manager for a restaurant at Disneyland Hotel. And boy, did it help me so much to remember this rule and to know that, you know, we're not alone in this, that we do have the availability of God, the Holy Spirit.
Amen. That's absolutely right. So as we talk about this golden rule of apologetics, it seems, George, that we're really talking about an intellectual code of conduct. You know, a lot of times Christians are well aware of what I would call their moral virtues, being faithful to their spouse, not stealing, sometimes Christians are kind of less aware of the intellectual virtues. And it seems to me that the golden rule of apologetics would emphasize things like when you're doing apologetics, you want to emphasize honesty, fair mindedness, civility, charity. And that's not always easy to do. I mean, I've had a few times where I kind of lost my cool in doing apologetics, and I had to go back to the drawing board and seek the Lord's forgiveness. And sometimes I've even had to say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I got a little heated up there." And but we are talking about an intellectual code of conduct, aren't we?
Yeah, and it brought back to memory. I remember when you used to teach at Walter Martin's Bible study class. I came down to Irvine or wherever it was, or Costa Mesa, and sat in while you were teaching. And I remember a couple of times a person coming to you very hot and heated. And but what stood out to me that time was how you were assertive without being aggressive in how you dealt with that person. So in counseling, we talk a lot about how to be assertive, but not being aggressive or passive or even passive aggressive. And so it's sort of a golden mean, as Aristotle talked about it, that we have to ride,
Yeah, I think what's really, really powerful when the golden rule of apologetics is practiced properly or in a very good way, it illustrates that we prize truth and intellectual honesty. I mean, one of the things I say on our podcast, Great Thinking, is that we're more interested in truth than we are in winning. A lot of times when people do apologetics, it seems like it's all about winning. It's all about shutting down the other person. But the golden rule of apologetics really challenges us to treat intellectually the way we want other people to treat us. George, I wonder if we could kind of talk now a little bit about some application. And I find it interesting that maybe we could take up what we do, how we engage people when we're reading other people's work, maybe critiquing other people's work. A lot of times you may be writing a book review. A lot of times you may be critiquing somebody else's position. Talk to me a little bit about how you see the golden rule of apologetics being applied to what other people write.
Yeah. I remember a person said it's a luxury to be understood. And developing the skill of understanding someone else, I think, is an important skill to be done. You do, I think, probably a lot more of this than I do. If I could throw it back to you, when you're reading someone else, how do you apply it when you're reading another person's, communication to you, another person's argument that they've raised against you? I've watched you do this for years. What goes on in your mind when you're applying this?
Yeah, as a teacher of logic, we spend a lot of time talking about informal fallacies. A fallacy in logic is just a breakdown in the reasoning process, and it can happen for various reasons. But there's a very important fallacy that I think we have to really attempt to avoid, and that's called the straw man fallacy. That means you misrepresent your opponent's argument. Maybe you make it look more exaggerated. I would say in applying the golden rule to apologetics, you want to be able to be very careful in conveying their real argument. Don't misrepresent, don't take it out of context. Be careful that your quotation isn't a misquotation. I even think, George, that when you're critiquing other people's arguments, particularly in a magazine, a book, whatever it may be, I try to put it in the strongest form. That is, I don't go looking for the weakest element in their argument. I try to engage their strongest argument and see if I can present that. And in fact, I saw this done very effectively. There's a professor at Talbot School of Theology, which is the seminary at Biola University, and Greg Gansel, who has been teaching there for a couple of years. Greg was critiquing Richard Dawkins's book. And Greg said, look, I don't think this argument that Dawkins is giving is really all that good. But I think if he changed it just a little bit, it could be much stronger. And I was just really impressed that Gansel actually tried to improve Dawkins' argument and then responded to that kind of argument. So, I felt like he was extending the benefit of the doubt. He was trying to get that person's argument right. And, I think a very important part of the golden rule of apologetics is treating other people's ideas, their viewpoints, their beliefs the way we want ours treated. And that really means being able to reflect them accurately and carefully and respectfully.
Yeah, I think one way someone has summed it up is instead of building a straw man, build a steel man.
Wow.
So you
Nice.
actually improve their argument. And when I teach philosophy, this is a skill I try to help students cultivate in saying, well, I hear this argument, and how can you build it up to even make it better? And that's where you understand people and engage with their thought much more deeply. How do you, when you're using things like Facebook and other social media, how do you do that on social media where there's a lot less space to develop your thoughts?
Yeah.
People's attention isn't the same.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I think that one of the things I try to do on social media is I try to use the person's name, instead of just blurting out my argument. I'll say, hey, George, I kind of want to address this. I also, after maybe I've presented an argument or offered a critique, I'll extend, hey, best wishes, all the best. And sometimes I'll ask them to clarify, hey, am I getting this right? It sounds like there's a problem in your argument, but I want to make sure that I've got it right. I want to make sure that I'm hearing it. And I also remember, George, that anything that goes on the web or social media will be there for a very long time. And if I respond, out of the heat of the belly in the midst of the confrontation, because I like to argue, I'll admit I like to argue. I like to evaluate other arguments. But I try to be very carefully. I ask myself, am I really comfortable with the way I've stated that? And what if other people came along and said, wow, that's kind of harsh or difficult? So social media, the web, make this practice more challenging, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. Also, when you're, I think one way to do it with a person is, psychologists in research have talked about how it's much easier to hear and discern a positive comment rather than something that's put into a negative. And I think that that's really important as well. I wrote down a quote from, I think it was Finney, but he said, it's of no use to misrepresent a person's doctrines to him and then try to reason him out of them.
Ah, very good.
Right?
Yeah.
And getting people's thoughts and ideas and arguments clear. Another person has said, I prefer clarity over agreement, to get clarity first. I'm curious how you do that over sort of hot button or difficult issues, whether they be conspiracy theories. There's so much discussion regarding the public health crisis. How do you apply this with very controversial and heated issues?
Yeah. I remember a quotation from the very famous atheist existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre's dates, by the way, are 1905 to 1980. Sartre had a very controversial quote, and I've never forgotten it. He said in his play No Exit, he said, "Hell is other people. Hell is other people." Well, I don't believe that. I believe there is a reality of hell. I believe it is the place of the judgment of God. But I think he was getting at something that is very important, and I think it relates to your question. And that is, I'm doing apologetics, and that isn't just arguments. It involves another person. It may involve multiple people. And as you say, it may involve people who have embraced what I might think is a conspiratorial line of reasoning. I I think I would shift at that point, and I would. One thing that I try to do, George, is if I'm in a heated debate, let's say about the moon landing deniers, or that the Earth is flat instead of a sphere, or that the one world government. I've had people write to me, for example, about all kinds of conspiracies. One thing that I try to do, George, when I'm interacting with people is I'm aware that when I'm in a heated debate, I kind of stop listening. I'm waiting for them to stop talking so I can jump in and get my point across. One thing I try to do is I try to stop, take a breath, actually try to listen to the other person and see if I can accurately repeat their argument to them. So I might say something like this: your central claim seems to be this, and you seem to be supporting that claim. You're supporting your conclusion by premises, and here are those premises. And then I'd stop and say, have I reflected your idea properly? You know what's interesting, when I'm able to do that, and I'm not always able to do it, there are times where I'm engaged and I'm thinking I'm going to knock down his points and try to make my points. But when I'm able to do that, George, I think there are a lot of benefits from being able to do that. I mean, when my wife and I have discussions, sometimes we even have arguments. I find that if I can repeat her concerns back to her, she feels heard. She feels like I understand her point of view, that this avoids misrepresentation. And of course, from a logical point of view, George, you can only critique the real thing. If you don't get your opponent's argument right, you can't really offer a critique. And again, I think it underscores this idea of truth over winning. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I sometimes, I want to distinguish if people are wrestling with an emotional burden or is it an intellectual weight. When it's an emotional burden, you give them an emotional hug, but on the intellectual side, I like to say we give them a logical hug
Wow.
in that sense. And you have to give people what I call the gift of time. Sometimes you have to slow down the conversation. And I used to use a technique in counseling with people. It's called, who has the floor? Like, who is allowed to speak at this moment? And I actually had a piece of tile, a piece of floor. And I would hand it to one person, and then they would start to talk or give their position or say how they've been hurt. And you could just watch the other person try to jump in. And I would say, well, who has the floor right now? And you don't have the floor. and then you can just see them getting amped up, wanting to get the floor. And slowing a conversation down, recognizing who has the floor, doing what you said about the active listening, giving people the gift of time, listening to what they have to say, and then waiting so that you can interact with it, I think are very, very important ways of handling not only written communication, but especially verbal communication with people.
Yeah, very good. I think that, I think our listeners are starting to appreciate, I hope, that the golden rule of apologetics is not always an easy thing to carry out. You're like treating other people the way you want to be treated. You're striving to practice these things, and you will make mistakes. I know one thing, George. It seems like there's a human tendency, if you have a very strong disagreement with someone, let's say they hold a very different worldview. So there is a clash of worldviews, or what philosophers might call an antithesis. I think there's oftentimes a tendency to want to attack the person rather than attacking the argument. And of course, in philosophy, we call this the ad hominem, to an attack against the person or an attack against the man. I try to constantly remember that stick with the argument, stick with the idea that is being discussed and debated. Stay away from personal attacks, stay away from kind of questioning somebody's motives. How important or significant do you think this attack idea is in the golden rule?
Well, if you think about a virtue, if this is the right understanding, every virtue has two vices, right? With courage, you could be cowardly. That's one vice, or you could have too much in one sense, be foolhardy.
Foolhardy.
You're right. And so maintaining that balance, almost like a balance beam, like you see in the Olympics, maintaining that balance is difficult. And you have to, I think, here's an illustration I offer up, especially when I'm interacting in a class or even with other people. It's one way to sort of coach myself. Think of this baseball illustration. If you're the batter and I'm the pitcher, what's my job? Well, to strike you out, to not let you get a hit,
Yeah,
right? And so it's an adversarial position in one sense. But if I'm the batting coach and you're the batter, well, that's a very different position to be in. I might offer suggestions, give some criticisms, give praise, but we're in a very different relationship. And I try to remind myself, and I even speak it out loud, because I can get into that mode too, where you start to attack the person and you don't deal with the issue. And so I say, well, think of me as your philosophy coach or your debating coach, or that. We're in a relationship together, and you too can play that role, where we're in support of one another so we can get on base, so we can hit the ball. And even in like marriage context, we try to use this principle, my wife and I, where when we're talking about an issue, we actually picture that the problem is over here and it's us two addressing the problem. So that the problem isn't the person in front of me, the problem is out here and we're trying to address it. And I think that takes away some of the antagonism or the attack mode, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very good. When you look at 1 Peter 3:15 through 17, always be, Peter tells us, I think that's kind of the mandate for doing apologetics. Peter says, always be ready to give to every man an answer, a reason for the hope that you have. But then he adds some qualifiers in terms of our attitude and our demeanor, to do it with gentleness, to do it with respect, keeping a clear conscience. And, George, that tells me that my attitude and my demeanor may be every bit as important as the very argument I'm trying to present. I mean, I'll be very candid with you. Sometimes when students want to present an argument, even if I agree with them, I'll kind of push back on them because I think they're being too strong or they're being too boisterous, and I want to correct it a little bit. I want to bring it back. How important is it for Christians to look at Peter's qualifiers there in 1 Peter 3?
That it's the difference between losing someone and sort of winning them over. I think our demeanor is 70% of the issue. I found this. I think there's good psychological research for that what my facial expression looks like. Am I smiling? Am I scowling? The body language part is very, very big. I think even in writing, what I had to do, because I made mistakes in communication, when I write something, I'll read it out loud, whether it's a post or something, so I can hear it and what it sounds like, even though it's in writing. And I think this is an important thing today, because it's so easy just to spout something off on social media very quickly without really taking into account or empathizing or sympathizing with the way someone might hear it or take it. And I'm curious how you deal with it. I mean, sometimes even for us Christians, we get sort of triumphant, or we take a triumphalistic approach. How do we guard against that, whether verbally or especially in writing? Because writing, you don't see the person's body language or the tone
That's
of
right.
their voice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One thing, George, that I attempt to do is I really try to stay away from sarcasm. I stay away from ridicule. I like to bring Christians together. I'm a very ecumenical guy. I like to think of myself as kind of a mere Christianity person. C.S. Lewis is one of my favorites. When I talk to people in different denominations, Lutheran, Baptist, Pentecostal, or when I talk to other branches of Christendom, people in the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, I really try to stay away from any kind of ridicule, any kind of sarcasm. I don't want to use satire. In fact, coming back to that ad hominem idea, you know, when while you want to avoid attacking somebody's character, there is, of course, oftentimes people will attack your character. And I think the temptation then is to attack back. Well, you attacked me. Now I'm gonna give you my punch. I think it's so critical, and it carries a lot of persuasion when we're able to resist that and actually reframe the argument. Stay away from the ad hominem, resist the temptation, come back. Don't use sarcasm. Don't use ridicule. Frame the argument again. Hey, let's get back to the ideas. Let's get back to the viewpoint or position. Let's stay away from, kind of the people issues. Now, I want to ask you a question because I've had people challenge me on this, and I know what I would say. For example, when I say don't use sarcasm, don't use ridicule, sometimes people say, hey, well, Jesus did. The Old Testament prophets did. So are you being kind of wimpy by not doing that? I know what I would say. I wonder what you would say.
Now I'm worried that what I will say will contradict what you think.
Well, I'll just attack you if I don't agree with you.
I think there is actually, when using humor, maybe we could distinguish between different kinds of sarcasm, perhaps. So there are things that I think, help diffuse a disagreement, or when you're wrestling with an issue, especially when you are following the rules, but the other person is not following the rules.
Yeah.
Right. And that's hard because you feel like, well, I'm following the rules. Why do you get to have an advantage over me by not following the rules? And there, I think sometimes humor, an ounce of sarcasm might actually help turn the conversation. But I think you're right about, we need to be careful that sarcasm is not a veiled attack on the person, their character, that it doesn't demean their position or who they are. Sometimes, and you would know this as a professor, you know a lot more because you've studied the issue than the person that you're dialoguing with. And you have to have the virtue of patience then, that take that coach role, even if they don't recognize that. How would you respond?
No, I like your comments, George. One thing that I try to say is, look, Jesus was the Son of God. He was God in human flesh. He had a unique ministry that is very different than mine. Jesus was a perfect person, and he had insight about the condition of somebody's heart. I have to be very careful about making judgments about the condition of somebody's heart. I mean, I may have to bring a moral critique of something that I think is immoral, but I want to be careful because I am a broken, wounded, scarred sinner who is saved by grace. So when I see the Old Testament prophets, I see partly there is a unique role that they have, but there may be time. And of course, when it comes to the ad hominem, you don't want to attack the character when the character is not the issue at hand. But there are times where character issues come up. I mean, I remember I was on a jury, And it was very important that I was able to, can I trust this person's word when they're making this claim? So certainly are times where I think we can bring up the character issue, but I try to be very careful because, I am also a person who struggles and strives. And uh, there are flat out times where I think that was Jesus's unique role. And if I'm going to practice that role, I want to do it with a lot of grace, with a lot of patience. Well, let's talk a little bit, George, if you don't mind, about I call this I offer this as 6 practices of apologetics fairness, and I'll kind of enumerate them a little bit and maybe ask you to comment on them a little bit. Um, let's suppose I am in a formal debate. Let's suppose I'm debating an atheist who holds a naturalistic worldview, or maybe I'm debating a Muslim who holds Islamic theism, or maybe a Hindu who holds kind of a pantheistic view. But one of the things that I'll attempt to do, either in writing or in a formal presentation, is I start with identifying the central tenets and beliefs of the person. I know when I wrote my book, now I got to remember the title of A World of Difference. I'm getting older. I'm in my 60s now. That was a worldview book. So an important part of the book was kind of talking about the Christian worldview. But George, I then looked at 4 other worldviews. I looked at naturalism, the secular worldview, secular postmodernism, and then I looked at 2 kind of religious worldviews, kind of pantheism and Islam. What I really wanted if an atheist or a Muslim or a Hindu or a person who advocates a postmodern perspective, George, what I wanted when they read that chapter to say, hey, he actually gets our view. He knows the central ideas that reflect our worldview. And so, again, that's part of that kind of getting it right. When I watch television and somebody comes on and talks about Christianity and they completely misrepresent historic Christianity, I mean, I just have an ache in my gut. I don't want to do that to somebody else. What do you have some thoughts about that? The idea of getting down other people's beliefs and focusing on what's central to their ideas.
Yeah, I was just listening to Peter Kreeft, who's the Catholic philosopher. He had recently written a book on the sacrament communion and 3 different views, and he uses 3 different characters in dialogue with those different views. And one of them was the character he uses is, I think, Billy Graham, and he said he said he could get into the mind or the head. He most identified with that, and people who have read it feel like they know what Billy Graham is saying, or what the character, they can identify with it. So when you get that good, when you're able to write in such a way that the other person identifies with it, I mean, I think that's really important. And sometimes when you do that in class, people think that you actually hold that view, and you kind of know you've done a good job at representing the view, and they come at you for it.
Yeah, I had a guy at my old church. He came up to me one day, and I was in a debate, dialogue with a Catholic theologian, and one of the guys came up and he says, "Ken, you're too gracious. You're gracious to a fault." Well, I guess it is possible to be, too friendly or too accommodating, if you will. But I think it's awfully important to reflect other people's views accurately. And I kind of view Peter Kreeft as kind of the Catholic C.S. Lewis. He's a great storyteller. He's able to present those ideas. Well, let me present another. Again, these are the 6 practices of apologetic fairness. And again, this is a webinar. And so if you are in the RTB scholar community or a visiting scholar, we put these on to try to help people to kind of think through issues. So my second practice, George, is affirm positive features of a belief system. For example, when I critique pantheism or pantheistic monism, kind of a philosophical Hinduism, I don't just start out hammering on the idea of karma. I say, I think Hindus are actually trying to get at something that's pretty important. They're talking about justice. They're talking about unity. There are positive elements. And even when I critique naturalism, I ask, what are the positives? It's very seldom that a viewpoint has all negatives and no positives. And I think what's helpful there too is that when people hear that I recognize the positive elements, they kind of let their guard down a little bit. They realize maybe we're having a discussion rather than a vigorous debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, if you can picture it like in a Venn diagram with putting two circles where they overlap, what common ground can you find that acts as a springboard to talk with people? And we're getting a number of questions in, and Prince asked this question that might have to do with this a little bit too. He says, what do you do when you follow the rules and you take time to understand your opponent's argument, but when you start pointing out the fallacies, if you've understood there, they just stick with their argument and they stand by it. They don't seem to acknowledge what the deficiency is. So if you stay on the positives, that's an important part that you're talking about. What happens when you move a little bit and you go to the critique and you point out something that doesn't seem to be coherent or correspond to the way the world is? How do you interact? How do you deal with a person like that?
Yeah, and I think I would underscore again that apologetics is not easy. It wasn't easy for the apostles. It wasn't easy for some of the great thinkers in church history, and it may not be easy for us. Again, Jean-Paul Sartre says, hell is other people. I mean, dealing with individuals who are coming from very different backgrounds is challenging. I think what I try to do in that situation, George, is I say, look, let me see if I can frame this. We're in an argument here. It's kind of tense. There's some common ground we have, but then there are some very serious disagreements. I might just kind of restate it. It seems to me you've taken this position, and you're backing it up with what you think are appeals here. But I'm actually arguing that maybe your reasoning is breaking down here. I think that there is I think that argument, to be perfectly candid, is fallacious. I don't think it follows logically. So, it may be that you have to just simply say, let's look at the argument, and then as patiently as you can point out that, appealing to emotion or appealing to a threat or appealing to things that are irrelevant, that doesn't support a really good argument. And I, with all due respect, I think you've made a mistake in your reasoning here. Now, of course, sometimes, and I've had apologetic encounters where I felt like, wow, everything I said didn't seem to have any effect. It was like a BB off the Rock of Gibraltar. And there are times where I have been on Twitter or Facebook, and it feels like all there is just that person is arguing A and I'm arguing Z, and never the twain shall meet. But of course, I believe that the Holy Spirit is ultimately the person who opens people's minds and hearts. And so I think you can be firm. I think you can be direct. I mean, if somebody says something that's false or incoherent, you're doing them a favor if you correct it. So I think you can be firm. But I think a lot of times there's a tendency to kind of dismiss people. So that's a great question. And I want to tell the person who asked that question, I struggle with that too. I think we all do.
Yeah, I remember when I was a pastor, I sometimes you're using stories or things like that. And one time I used a story to support my point, and I found out later that the story was actually a satirical account. I thought it was a real story, and it had come from some place like The Onion or a place like that. And I was really, really embarrassed. And but it's truth is what matters, and I had to apologize for using that account. And you have to set the record straight. We have to show people that we care more about the truth than our ideas. And that might sound funny at first, but I have my various ideas, but I should care about the truth more and whether or not my ideas link up with the truth. And I certainly have made that mistake on a number of occasions.
And again, I would say that you need to make your argument. You need to make it as clearly, carefully, as convincingly as you can. But I think, again, the golden rule of apologetics means that we, as you articulately just said, we care more about truth than we do about winning. A third element, George, of this kind of 6 practices is, I say, quote the most authoritative sources. I mean, if I'm critiquing atheistic naturalism, I want to stay away from kind of the less scholarly sources. I mean, I would like to convey to the person that, hey, I know who some of the better atheist scholars are. And even at an article, I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago about where Christianity differed with Islam. But in the endnotes, I said, hey, here is a really good book written by a Muslim scholar. I think it's Islam 101. I think this guy does a very good job of describing Islam. Now, my article was to say Islam and Christianity contradict each other. And if Christianity is true, Islam cannot be true. But the reverse is true. If Islam is true, Christianity couldn't be true, because Islamic theology denies the essence of Christianity. But in the end, I wanted to be fair. I didn't want to just quote all these Christian sources. I wanted to say, there really is a good book on the other side. And George, what I often do with my students is I'll have them write a term paper, maybe in an ethics class. I know you teach ethics. So, they might decide to write a paper on capital punishment or abortion or euthanasia. I will tell them, lay out your case, make the best case, but near the end of your paper, I want to hear what you think are the best arguments against your position, and then tell me how you would respond. And, over the years, I've had many students come back and say, I didn't know that there actually is a kind of formidable argument against my position. How important do you think it is in that kind of attempt to be fair?
I think it shows a level of integrity that you've researched the subject, that you're willing to take the time to engage the most thoughtful people that disagree with you. And most of the time, it's only going to sharpen you rather than detract from your view. I think it probably will strengthen it. And I do the same thing with my students. I ask them to not just write from a Christian perspective, but to do it from a completely another perspective. And that's a good discipline to have. But at the same time, I want to ask you, I think we get nervous in doing that, both as teachers and just maybe as friends or maybe as a parent, to hand over the best argument from the other side. You get worried, well, will this create more doubt? Will this create more emotional burden? How do you deal with that struggle?
Yeah, I mean, I ask myself, what is the best argument against historic Christianity being true? And I think for me, I think the problem of evil is challenging. It's not that we don't have some really good logical comebacks. I mean, I don't think that there is a deductive form of evil that defeats Christianity. I mean, I think people from Augustine to Alvin Plantinga to Richard Swinburne through the centuries, Christian thinkers have responded to the deductive problem of evil. And I think we can make a solid case that the inductive argument against evil is not convincing. But I'll tell you, George, every time I drive by the Children's Hospital of Orange County, and I know there are kids in there that have cancer, I realize, wow, if the problem of evil is not a logical defeater for Christianity, there are times where I wonder, Lord, why? Why is there so much evil in the world? So I don't want to necessarily give the person, a club that they can then use to pound on my worldview. But I really do want to convey to them that, hey, look, I've thought about Christianity. I haven't stopped thinking as a Christian. I am aware that you could marshal arguments that at least seem to be critiquing my view. I guess I want that person to walk away and think that even though I am an apologist, ultimately I care about truth so much that I'm willing to give and take. And then I may say now, maybe to an atheist, I might say now to have evil, don't you have to have a standard of goodness? Isn't evil a violation or a breaking down of goodness? Where does that goodness come from? So I may try to deal with their challenge and then maybe say, here's a challenge for you.
Yeah, Ken, we have a question on this from Randall. He says, do you think it's appropriate to correct someone on their beliefs just to promote a more accurate faith? For instance, like sharing how a verse isn't applicable to the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. That's really good. I mean, I think one thing that question really illustrates, George, is there are a lot of different kind of apologetics. I mean, we might be doing science apologetics. We might be doing historical or philosophical apologetics. We might be doing what in the old days we called counter-cult apologetics. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons still knock at my door, and they'll show me a passage, and I say, well, biblical exegesis, you want to lead out the meaning of the passage. You want to be careful not to read into that passage. And of course, you might point out that that passage has limited application. It may not be a universal kind of component. I certainly think we ought to correct misperceptions and errors, but I think we need to strive. And I don't always do it. Sometimes I'm a smart aleck. Sometimes I'm angry, but I think we ought to strive to say, I make mistakes too, and to try to convey a sense of humility. And I think people listening to this, they might be thinking, man, how good do I need to be? How fair-minded should I be? How humble should I be? I would remind all of our listeners that we're all in the striving business. Personally, I don't think I've loved God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, and my neighbor as myself for 15 minutes. I'm striving. And you quoted Dallas Willard that I am saved by grace, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be hard at it, coming back, dealing with my issues. So that's kind of what I think. I do ask myself, sometimes as a scholar, you could embarrass another person. Sometimes as a professor, you alluded to it. I may know a lot more, and I could make you look really bad. But maybe I want to say, hey, let's do a little role playing here. Let's give and take. That's such a good question.
Yeah, I think I've made that mistake before, especially in class, where I'm having so much fun with it. I find out over time people are no longer asking questions because I've come on too strong, or maybe I don't intend this, but I shut down their position. And I have to remind myself to be in the coach position and to also be in a learning posture in the dialogue with people. The Bible actually has a lot to say. It makes a distinction in Proverbs in the New Testament between being quarrelsome and arguing. And I would like to say, as a philosopher, a Christian philosopher, getting into quarrels is bad, but arguments are good. And I'm
Yeah.
reminded of the 2 Timothy verse, chapter 2, where he says, "The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kindly to everyone, an apt teacher, patient, correcting opponents," and then the qualifier, "with gentleness. God may perhaps grant that they will repent," and that Greek word for repent, it partially means to rethink your thinking. And so that they would rethink their thinking and come to know the truth, and that they may escape from the snare of the devil, having been held captive by him to do his will. That's a key verse, I think, in this discussion.
Yeah, and Paul says that we really destroy arguments. We again, he doesn't say we destroy people. We attack the argument. We show that it's unsound. It is not a belief that carries the truth. Well, let me touch upon a couple more of these 6 practices, George. 4 is give the critique belief system the benefit of the doubt. I think sometimes there's a tendency to assume the worst about other people, where there are times I have to step back and say, I don't know all that for sure. And the reality is, I have struggles in my own life. Maybe maybe I go out to lunch with George, and he's kind of short with me. He kind of seems difficult that day. Maybe I'll come back and say, hey, maybe something's happening. Maybe there are things I don't know. I like this idea of trying to extend the benefit of the doubt. It's golden rule of apologetics does not mean you accept that other person's view. You may rigorously disagree, but it does mean you show some grace.
Yeah, I think as just in other vocations, like when I was a server, when I was a manager for the restaurant at Disney, when you're put in those positions, working with the public and people, you really have to develop a skill of actively listening to the person, hearing their complaint, and also meeting their emotional status, right? If they're really exercised over something, I want to show an emotional concern that meets where their emotion is at. I remember one time, this is going back a ways, but I was manager, and a person, I was told to go to a table, and the person said, "My steak is cooked medium," and I ordered it medium rare. And this is a fine dining restaurant, and so the customer is right. But I had just returned from Craiova, Romania, right after the wall fell, and Ceausescu was killed and taken out of power. And there was hardly any, food was scarce. You went to a fine dining restaurant there, they literally asked you, "Do you want pig or cow?" And it was a very tough situation for the Romanians at the time. But I came back, and the first day, I hear this person complaining. And so I got really stirred up inside. Yeah. But I knew he didn't have that context. He didn't have that experience at the time. If I would have unloaded on him, it would have been very inappropriate at that particular time. And that's just an illustration to say is we have to be mindful. We don't know the context of what's going on with a person in a number of cases. Sometimes we do, but we have to be gentle and respectful with where they're at that time.
And I think as we think about arguments on one hand and persuasion on the other, arguments are always a very critical part of persuading. But the great rhetorician Aristotle said that we need ethos, pathos, and logos. That is that the persuading process always involves logos, always involves logic. But for the ancient Greeks, philosophers, they thought that you had to carry kind of a ethical virtuousness, and you needed a little empathy, in that persuasion. And so extending the benefit of the doubt can be an important part of the persuading process. My 5th principle, George, is to, if possible, allow a review of your analysis. before I came to Reasons to Believe, I worked at the Christian Research Institute, had the great pleasure of working with and for Walter Martin, who was one of my mentors, and I think one of the most unique apologists in the evangelical world in the 20th century. But Elliot Miller and I wrote a book right about 1992 where we offered a evangelical Protestant evaluation and critique of the Catholic view of Mary and Catholic Mariology. I went overseas. I went to Yugoslavia and talked with people at Medjugorje, where people claim to have seen the Virgin Mary. And one of the things after the manuscript was done, I went to Elliot and I said, you know what? I think we ought to get a really good Catholic thinker and let him respond and actually put it in the back of our book. And Elliot looked at me like, what? Why do you want to do that? And I said, we don't have anything to hide. We actually want there to be a discussion. Elliot was a little resistant, but finally he agreed. And now when I look back, 28 years ago, I really thought that I allowed a person who held the position I was critiquing to be able to respond. I mean, that would be pretty refreshing if you critiqued a view and said, now I'd like to actually hear what you think. Now, don't get me wrong. I had some people on Amazon who said, wow, Ken and Elliot are compromisers. They allowed, a Catholic priest to respond, and they should never have done that. But again, I was trying to convey the idea I want the truth more than I want to win. So it's not always easy to do that, but it is something I'm really glad that we did. Well, here's number 6, George. And we touched upon this a little bit earlier. I think it's important to always list sources that defend the critiqued position. I think it illustrates a certain level of objectivity. I think it illustrates that, hey, I know the lay of the land. I personally don't think the new atheists are all that formidable, but I think there are some of the old atheists that actually are more formidable. And so in a paper, I want to convey to people that, look, I've thought a lot about this, and I've actually tried to listen to other people. So again, that's extending what I think is involved in the Golden Rule. A sense of fair-mindedness, a sense of carefulness, if possible, a sense of deference and respect is what I think. And again, I underscore, George, we're all striving, and maybe it's possible we're too harsh. It could also be possible that maybe times we're not strong enough. But apologetics it seems like a contact sport at certain times. There are times I've walked away from social media thinking, wow, did I waste my time? It seemed like it didn't go the way I hoped it went. But then I try to remind myself that I'm not the person ultimately that is going to do the persuading. I see the Holy Spirit's critical role in someone coming to faith. What do you think, as we sum up some of this, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I've heard someone say, I'm saved or I'm rescued by God because I'm right. In other words, I have the right view. But I think that's actually probably should be flipped based off of what you just said. I was rescued, and then I discovered I was right. In other words, grace comes first, and then I discover through God's persuasion, the Holy Spirit, that this is the true view. This is the correct view. And in fact, I went through this early on in my Christian faith. I had grown up nominally a Catholic, had great parents who I think had a reverence for God, and then I came to a point of having this personal relationship. But what I did was I was studying electrical engineering, and I switched my major to comparative religions. And part of the reason I did it is I wanted to see whether or not this was true, what I believed. So I went through and I was alone. I wasn't a part of a church at the time. And here I was learning Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, non-traditional religions. And it forced me to understand other faiths, but also how they compared to mine. But then I felt like I discovered, no, this really is the truth. Jesus did rise from the dead, and the other truths that follow from that. As we wrap up here, Ken, what are some ways in your thinking that this can be applied to our scholar community and apologetics community? What comments would you have or encouragements in applying this in those communities?
I think one thing that I would say, and again, we're talking about ideals. We are talking about principles that, again, we're striving for. So if folks are listening and saying to themselves, wow, I don't always fulfill all of the things that Ken and George are talking about, remember, neither have I. There have been times where I thought I really need to go back and work on my demeanor and attitude. And yet I would say that I think a very important part of becoming part of the scholar community, being a visiting scholar, being an apologist in conjunction with reasons to believe, that this idea really is a very important one for RTB. I think it reflected very well in our president, Hugh Ross. It is something that, our board members, it's something that the leaders of RTB think is a critical virtue. And so I would encourage people to recognize that when Peter gives that mandate in 1 Peter 3:15, it's not give a person a reason at all costs, no matter what. It does involve these challenging virtues of being gentle, being respectful, not doing something, not fudging the facts, being honest. And so I would say, look, these are not easy things to fulfill. But I would say to those who are listening, who are part of our community, that neither is this something that's unimportant. It really is an important, and I think it is. We get into RTB has kind of a unique position on creation. We're old Earth, so we differ with our young Earth friends. We don't hold to evolution, and so we differ with our evolutionary creation friends. Sometimes those positions can be pretty strong and tense. Sometimes we can look across the aisle and think, hey, I think you're making a big mistake there. But I think that Reasons to Believe has something very much to share in terms of what's true, what's correct about science and scripture. But I think RTB also has something very important to communicate in terms of growing to be and to have Christian character, to have Christian virtue. And kind of as I began, George, as we talked together, the Bible does talk about moral virtues. I mean, I'm married, and so I'm committed to my wife. I don't want to steal things. I take very strongly that I get a paycheck, and I want to earn my paycheck. And also, though, there are virtues in the intellect of being honest, being careful, being fair-minded. And so I hope that our discussion today is helpful, maybe motivating, maybe even a little convicting, but I also hope that it's really encouraging. And I want to say this, George, about our scholar community, about the various scholars who've come alongside and want to see themselves as part of representing that RTB community. I want to say, George, how encouraging it is to me. I meet all of these men and women. They often have advanced degrees, specialized training, sometimes a lot more than I do. And I think, wow, I feel encouraged in my faith because I'm surrounded with this shadow of witnesses, if you will. And they are not only so smart and well educated, but they're so gracious. And that gives me even more confirmation that my beliefs are on the right track. that affirming Christianity is really true.
Yeah, with Krista and Tracy and Fuzz, we do interviews as people come into the community. And I've often said after those interviews, I go, wow, Christianity really works. And what I mean by that is you see people who could be puffed up in their knowledge, but they really have taken on the virtues of Christ and the mind of Christ, so that when we interact with people, like when we do posts to a Google group forum or things like that, sometimes we do it to everybody, but if I don't understand something, sometimes I just respond directly to the person and not the whole forum, so I can make sure I've understood them, and then I can go back online and talk about it in a group form. And that's sort of applying that Matthew 18 principle, where you're going directly to the person to make sure you've heard them right, or sometimes maybe I need to be convicted of something, and then you kind of branch it out to greater and greater circles. And I agree with you. So many of our people have those virtues of gentleness and respect, and we really want to keep that going as a defining value and a defining aspect of our communities, both in the apologetics and scholar community.
Well, I want to again say that this is a webinar. It is a time to do some coaching and some instruction, and again focused on the folks who have become part of our scholar community. As you can see from both George's comment and my comment, we respect and admire and appreciate the people that are involved, and I also appreciate the work of Krista and Tracy and Fuzz, who have spent a lot of time making what I think is really a very good program. So thank you for listening. I hope that this program, again, is helpful and meaningful and purposeful.